Picture this. April 9th, 1241. You are a Polish knight, armor weighing 60 pounds, sweat already soaking to the padding beneath your chainmail. Your warhorse shifts nervously beneath you. Ahead, through the morning mist rising off the Silesian plains, you see them, a sea of riders stretching to the horizon. 10,000, maybe more. The Mongols. Your formation is 70 men. 70. You can hear them now. Not war cries. That will be merciful. Instead, there's a rhythmic drumming, a sound like distant thunder that grows louder with each heartbeat. Your hand tightens on your lance, though it feels impossibly fragile. Around you, the finest warriors in Christendom, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic knights, men who have never known defeat, men who are about to learn what happens when medieval chivalry collides with the most sophisticated war machine the world has ever seen. The drums stop. The silence is worse. Then you see it. The Mongol front line parts like a curtain, and from within that gap, arrows begin to rise. Not dozens, thousands. They blot out the sun, turning morning into twilight. You raise your shield. The first impact sounds like hail on a cathedral roof. This is Liegnitz, the day Europe learned that courage alone is not enough, before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering. If you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand what happened at Liegnitz, we must strip away the romantic myths that have calcified around this battle for 8 centuries. History tells us this was a heroic last stand, a shining moment of medieval valor. That is a lie, or rather, it's an incomplete truth, the kind of story we tell ourselves to make sense of absolute catastrophe. Here are the facts. In 1241, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. From the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, Genghis Khan's successors commanded a military force that had conquered kingdoms, toppled dynasties, and reduced cities to rubble with methodical precision. They were not barbarians. They were engineers of warfare operating at a level of sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for another 400 years. Their Western campaign, led by Battle Khan and the brilliant General Subutai, had already devastated Russia, Georgia, and Bulgaria. Now, in early 1241, multiple Mongol armies, perhaps 150,000 warriors in total, swept into Poland and Hungary simultaneously. This wasn't raiding. This was invasion architecture. The Mongols moved with YAM stations providing logistics, with sophisticated intelligence networks feeding information about European defenses, with tactical coordination across thousands of miles that European kingdoms could barely manage across a single valley. Poland stood directly in their path. Duke Henry II the Pious understood what was coming. Historical record described him as a capable leader, devout, and under no illusions about the odds. When word reached him that a Mongol Tamun, a division of 10,000 riders, was advancing toward Liegnitz, he made a calculated decision. He would gather what forces he could and delay them, not defeat them, delay them, because racing toward Poland from the west was King Wenceslaus I of Bohemia with an army of 50,000 men. If Henry could buy just 2 days, the combined Christian forces might actually stand a chance. So Duke Henry assembled his army. Modern historians debate the exact numbers. Some sources claim as few as 2,000 total combatants. Others suggest 8,000. But the elite corps, the shock troops, were the knights. And here's where the legend crystallizes into that mythic number, 70 knights. Whether this represented the entirety of Henry's mounted elite or simply the most notable noble warriors is lost to time. What matters is this. They were outnumbered at least 5 to 1, possibly 50 to 1. The Mongol force approaching Liegnitz was commanded by Kaidu, grandson of Ogidi Khan, and the infamous General Baidar. These men had cut their teeth in the conquest of China. They had broken the Khwarezmian Empire. They had annihilated Russian princes at the Khalkhal River. Liegnitz would be another Tuesday. The European knights rode heavy war horses, wore layered armor that made them nearly invulnerable in close combat, and wielded lances that could punch through shield walls. They were trained from childhood for single combat, for tournaments, for glory. They believed, genuinely believed, that faith, courage, and superior metallurgy would carry the day. The Mongols rode light steppe ponies that could travel 70 miles in a day. They carried composite bows with a draw weight of 160 pounds that could pierce armor at 200 yards. They fought as coordinated units, executing complex maneuvers with whistle signals and flag commands. They had psychological warfare divisions whose sole job was manufacturing terror. By all calculated metrics, what happened here should have been impossible. Not the Mongol victory. That was inevitable. What was impossible was that anyone survived to tell the story at all. The decision that sealed Duke Henry's fate came 3 days before the battle. In the wooden halls of his castle at Wrocław, scouts had returned with reports that turned faces pale. The Mongol force wasn't simply advancing, it was accelerating. They were burning villages not for plunder but for logistics, destroying food supplies to prevent any pursuing Christian army from sustaining itself. They were kidnapping locals and forcing them to spread tales of atrocities, seeding panic that spread faster than any horse could ride. Henry's advisors begged him to wait. 2 more days, they said. Wenceslas is coming. 2 more days. But the Mongols weren't giving him 2 days. Their scouts, themselves traveling in groups of 50 to 100, were already probing the outskirts of Liegnitz. If Henry waited, the Mongols would bypass him entirely, strike in the heart of Poland, and be gone before the Bohemian reinforcements ever arrived. Henry looked at his assembled knights, Templars who had fought in the Holy Land, Hospitallers who had held the walls of Acre, Teutonic knights who had carved kingdoms from pagan Prussia, German mercenaries who knew only war, Polish nobility whose ancestors had defended these lands for generations. According to the chronicler Jan de Lugas, writing a century later, Henry addressed them with grim clarity. "We are not seeking victory today. We are buying time with our blood." This wasn't bravado. This wasn't heroic speech-making. This was mathematics. Henry understood he was leading these men to slaughter, but they could engage the Mongols. Even for a few hours, it might create enough chaos to slow the invasion's timetable. He issued the order to march at dawn. What Henry didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Subutai, coordinating the entire campaign from hundreds of miles away, had already accounted for European nobility's predictable sense of honor. The Mongol strategy depended on exactly this kind of response. They wanted the European knights to come to them. They wanted them angry. They wanted them eager. They wanted them charging. Because the Mongols had spent 40 years perfecting the art of turning cavalry charges into mass graves. This wasn't just military strategy. It was psychological engineering. And Duke Henry II the Pious had just walked straight into the trap. The armies sighted each other on April 9th, 1241, across the Wallstatt plain near Liegnitz. The name would later be translated from German, chosen place, or more grimly, place of slaughter, prophecy or coincidence. History leaves that question open. The terrain itself was a character in what was about to unfold. The Silesian plain stretched flat and open, excellent ground for cavalry, which should have favored the heavily armored European knights. But this flatness was deceptive. Spring melt had left the ground soft in patches, treacherous for heavy war horses whose hooves could sink and catch. For the Mongol ponies, lighter and more agile, this was no obstacle at all. Duke Henry deployed his forces in traditional European fashion. Knights in the center, infantry on the flanks, a reserve held back. The formation looked impressive, a wall of steel and horseflesh that had broken countless armies. The knights' armor caught the morning sun, transforming them into gleaming figures of divine wrath. Banners snapped in the wind. The Black Cross of the Teutonic Order, the Red Cross of the Templars, the White Cross of the Hospitallers, Henry's own golden eagle on blue. It was beautiful. It was doomed. Across the field, the Mongol force arranged itself in a formation that made no sense to European eyes. Instead of a solid line, they spread out in loose clusters, Mangudai units of light cavalry that seemed to have no cohesion. To the European commanders, it looked like disorder. It looked vulnerable. This was the first illusion. The Mongol force was organized with mathematical precision. The front units were Mangadai, lightly armored horse archers whose job was not to fight but to harass. Behind them, invisible until needed, were the heavy cavalry, Mongol lancers in lamellar armor who served as shock troops. And behind them, concealed by the gentle roll of terrain, were reserve units ready to plug any gap or exploit any breakthrough. Each unit of 10 men had a leader. Each unit of 100 had a commander. Each unit of 1,000 coordinated through signals invisible to European eyes. Flag movements, whistle codes, the angle of a raised lance. When a Mongol army moved, it moved as a single organism. The European force, for all its bravery, moved as a collection of individual heroes. The Mongols did not immediately attack. This, too, was tactical. They waited as the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm. Waited as the European knights sat in armor that became ovens. Waited as horses grew thirsty and men grew impatient. Psychological warfare. The Mongols were fighting the battle before a single arrow flew. Finally, around mid-morning, the Mongols moved. A single unit of Mangadai, perhaps 200 riders, galloped forward, not charging, probing. They approached to within 300 yards of the European line and stopped. Then, with precision that spoke to endless drilling, they knocked arrows. The Mongol composite bow was a work of engineering genius. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, it could store tremendous energy in a compact frame. A skilled archer could loose 10 arrows per minute. These 200 riders represented 2,000 arrows in the first minute alone. The arrows came in waves, high arcing shots that fell like deadly rain. The sound was distinctive, a whistle as the shafts cut air, then the hammering percussion as they struck shields, armor, earth. Most bounced off the knight's armor. Most, but some found gaps, visors, joints, the vulnerable necks of horses. And the infantry with lesser armor began to take casualties. A knight spurred forward, breaking formation. Others followed. It was instinctive. You don't stand and take arrows. You close distance and engage. This was what they'd been trained to do. The Mongols wheeled and retreated. The Parthians shot, firing backwards from horseback at full gallop. Emptied saddles even as they fled. The European knights pursued, gaining speed, their charge building momentum. And then the Mangadai vanished. Not retreated. Vanished. They split left and right with such synchronization it seemed rehearsed. Because they'd practiced this maneuver 1,000 times. The European knights, committed to their charge, suddenly found themselves thundering forward into empty space. That's when the smoke began. From hidden positions, Mongol soldiers ignited smoke pots, bundles of damp straw, greenwood, and substances that produced thick, acrid clouds. Within seconds, the battlefield transformed into a gray void. Visibility dropped to yards. The neat European formation disintegrated into chaos as knights lost sight of their commanders, their banners, each other. In that smoke, the Mongols were perfectly oriented. They had rehearsed fighting blind. They used whistle signals that cut through the murk. They knew exactly where every friendly unit was positioned. The Europeans knew nothing. And then, from 3 sides simultaneously, the Mongol heavy cavalry struck. If the story of defiance against impossible odds resonates with you, please give this video a like. It truly helps these stories reach more people. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into history's turning points. Imagine being Brother Dietrich, a Templar knight 24 years old, who took his vows 3 years earlier in Acre. You came to Poland expecting to fight pagans in Prussia. Instead, you're here, in smoke so thick you can barely see your horse's head. You hear screaming. It's coming from everywhere and nowhere. The man to your right, you don't know his name, suddenly pitches from his saddle with 3 arrows in his back. Arrows that came from behind. How did they get behind? Your training screams at you. Hold formation. But what formation? You can't see anyone. You turn your horse left, then right. Through a gap in the smoke, you glimpse a Mongol rider, bow drawn. You spur toward him. He looses. The arrow glances off your helmet with a sound like a bell tolling. You're 5 yards away. 4, 3. He's gone, dissolved into the smoke like a demon. Your horse stumbles. You look down. There's an arrow in its haunch. Not fatal, but painful. The animal's movements become erratic. You try to control it, but now there are more riders around you. Mongol lancers in dark armor, moving with horrible purpose. They're not engaging you one-on-one. They're circling. You realize with sick certainty that you're being herded. You think of Jerusalem, of the vows you took. You remember the words, non nobis, domini, non nobis, sed nomini tua de gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto thy name give glory. You lower your lance and charge at the nearest shadow. For Brother Dietrich. The battle ends 17 seconds later. His name appears on no chronicle. His body was never identified. He was one of thousands who simply ceased to exist that day, swallowed by smoke and violence and the efficient machinery of the Mongol war machine. But he charged anyway. The Mongol encirclement was complete within 20 minutes of initial contact. This wasn't a battle. It was a collapse. The heavy Mongol cavalry hit the European flanks with devastating precision. Their lances, longer and lighter than European designs, thrust forward in coordinated waves. The impact was catastrophic. European horses, already exhausted from the charge, stumbled. Knights went down, and once a knight was on the ground, the armor that made him invincible became his tomb. The weight made rising impossible. The Mongols didn't waste time on fallen opponents. Mobile kill teams followed the main assault. Light cavalry with axes and swords whose sole job was finishing wounded enemies. They moved systematically, like harvesters in a field. The sound was indescribable. The clash of metal on metal. The screaming of horses, worse than human screaming, a sound that burrows into your soul. The wet thud of arrows finding flesh. The shouting in half a dozen languages, as men called for help that wasn't coming. And underneath it all, the whistle signals of Mongol commanders, coordinating the slaughter with terrifying efficiency. Duke Henry, in the center of his formation, realized the magnitude of the disaster. Chronicles suggest he attempted to rally his knights for a breakout charge. One final push to puncture the encirclement. It was tactically sound. It was also impossible. The Mongols had anticipated every European response. When Henry's corps guard formed up for their charge, they found themselves facing a prepared pike formation that appeared from the smoke as if summoned. The first rank of knights impaled themselves on pikes held at braced angles. The second rank crashed into the first. The third rank tried to wheel away and rode straight into a fresh wave of arrows. This was warfare's engineering. Every European move had a prepared counter. Every act of courage was met with cold calculation. The Mongols weren't fighting angry. They were fighting bored. In 17 minutes, the core of European resistance shattered. Duke Henry and his personal guard made one last desperate run for the edge of the battlefield. They almost made it. Mongol pursuit units caught them 300 yards from safety. The Duke's horse took an arrow in the throat and went down hard. Henry, still armored, hit the ground and couldn't rise quickly enough. What happened next became legend, recorded in multiple chronicles. A Mongol warrior named, according to later accounts, Kokashur or perhaps Kuyuk, dismounted and approached the fallen Duke. Henry, on his knees, made no attempt to flee. He crossed himself, spoke a prayer in Polish that his killer neither understood nor cared about. The sword stroke was efficient, professional. The Duke's head came off with a single blow. This wasn't cruelty. This was policy. The Mongols had learned in decades of conquest that decapitating leadership, literally, accelerated enemy collapse. Kokashur picked up Henry's head by its hair and held it aloft, around the battlefield. Other Mongol warriors saw the signal and amplified it. Within minutes, every European combatant still alive knew their commander was dead. The rout began. Men threw down weapons and ran. The Mongols pursued with methodical patience, running down stragglers the way wolves take elk. Some Europeans made it to the nearby forest. The Mongols followed the men. Some made it to a stream and tried to swim across in full armor. They drowned. Some simply collapsed from exhaustion and waited for the end. By early afternoon, the Battle of Liegnitz was over. The actual combat had lasted less than 3 hours. The body count remains disputed. European sources claimed up to 30,000 dead, but this is certainly inflated. Henry's entire force was likely no more than 8,000 to 10,000 combatants. More realistic estimates suggest 5,000 to 7,000 European deaths. What is certain is that the elite corps, those legendary 70 Knights, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, were annihilated almost to a man. Of the senior commanders, only a handful escaped. Mongol casualties? The chronicles barely mention them. Best estimates suggest fewer than 500 dead, a ratio of 10 to 1, possibly higher. The Mongols didn't celebrate. They processed. Teams moved across the battlefield, collecting arrows for reuse, looting armor and weapons, systematically killing the wounded. Other teams gathered the ears of the fallen. The Mongols tallied battlefield victories by enemy ears, needing proof for their commanders. According to multiple sources, they collected 9 sacks worth. They displayed Duke Henry's head on a lance and paraded it around Liegnitz, showing the population what happened to those who resisted. Then they attached it to the city gates as a warning. His body was later recovered and buried at Wrocław. His head was never found. When the last screams faded and silence claimed the Wallstatt plain, what remained was a landscape transformed into nightmare. A German chronicler who visited the site days later described it. The field was so covered with bones and skulls that it appeared as a mountain range of death. The ground was softened not by rain but by blood, such that horses' hooves sank into crimson mud. The ravens and crows grew so fat they could not fly. The immediate tactical aftermath was swift. The Mongol force under Kaidu and Baidar secured Liegnitz, extracted what supplies they needed, burned what they couldn't carry, and moved on. They didn't occupy. They didn't hold territory. This wasn't conquest in the European sense. It was erasure. They were clearing the board. But here's where the myth and reality diverge in fascinating ways. Traditional accounts claim Liegnitz was a meaningless massacre, a footnote in the larger Mongol invasion. This is wrong. The battle achieved exactly what Duke Henry intended, though at catastrophic cost. It delayed the Mongols by 3 critical days. Those 3 days prevented Kaidu's force from linking up with the southern Mongol army invading Hungary. It forced the Mongols to adjust their timetable. It gave King Wenceslaus of Bohemia time to fortify defensive positions rather than being caught in the open. Most importantly, it demonstrated to European powers that the Mongols were not invincible. They could be engaged, they could be slowed, even if they couldn't be stopped. The tactical postmortem is brutal in its clarity. The Europeans lost because they fought the battle their enemy wanted them to fight. Every instinct that made knights effective in European warfare, aggression, pursuit of glory, individual heroism, became a liability against Mongol doctrine. The charge that won battles against French knights or English longbowmen was suicide against an army that had been practicing the feigned retreat for generations. The armor that made them unkillable in close combat made them slow, exhausted, and vulnerable to exactly the kind of mobile warfare the Mongols perfected. The Mongols won because they had institutionalized warfare in a way Europe wouldn't match until Napoleonic era. They had logistics, communications, reconnaissance, and combined arms tactics. They had units that trained together for years. They had commanders selected by merit, not birth. They had a military doctrine refined across dozens of campaigns against every conceivable enemy. When the two systems collided at Liegnitz, the outcome was never in doubt. The question was only how long the Europeans would take to die. But the Mongols did not have it all their way in. The larger campaign. 2 days after Liegnitz, their main force in Hungary was checked at the Battle of Mohi, a Mongol victory, but a costly one. And then, suddenly the invasion stopped. Ogedei Khan, the great Khan himself, died in December 1241. By Mongol law, all princes of the blood had to return to Mongolia to elect a successor. Battle Khan, leading the European invasion, withdrew every Mongol unit from Poland and Hungary. The armies that had seemed unstoppable, that had shattered every defense, simply vanished back into the steppes. Europe had been saved not by its armies, but by the death of a ruler 6,000 miles away. If you made it this far, you're clearly someone who values the deep, often overlooked stories that define who we are. Please make sure you're subscribed and have the bell notification turned on. I have a lot more forgotten history to uncover with you, but the story didn't end there. The ripples from Liegnitz spread across centuries. In the immediate term, the battle became a rallying cry. Pope Innocent IV used the Mongol threat to call for unity among fractured European kingdoms. The trauma of 1241 accelerated the development of military orders specifically designed to defend eastern borders. The Teutonic Knights expanded their power base in Prussia partly on the justification that they were the shield against Asian hordes. Militarily, Liegnitz forced a reckoning with European tactical doctrine. Knights began to drill in larger formations rather than relying on individual prowess. Commanders started studying intelligence and reconnaissance, concept the Mongols had mastered but Europeans treated as dishonorable. Within a generation, European armies began incorporating light cavalry and mobile archers, though they would never match Mongol proficiency. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. For 1,000 years, European military identity had centered on the armored knight, the ultimate weapon, the pinnacle of martial evolution. Liegnitz demonstrated that this entire worldview was obsolete. A single day shattered the mythology of invincible chivalry. Polish national identity was forged partly in the memory of this sacrifice. Duke Henry II became Saint Henry, martyred in defense of Christendom. Liegnitz itself became a pilgrimage site. The battle entered the cultural DNA as a story about choosing to fight even when victory is impossible, about buying time for others with your own death. But let's play the counterfactual. What if Henry had waited? What if he let the Mongols pass and joined forces with Wenceslaus? The combined Christian army would have been formidable, perhaps 60,000 men. Against this force, even the Mongols would have faced genuine challenge. But it also would have meant abandoning Lower Silesia to Mongol ravaging. It would have meant letting the invaders dictate terms, choose the battlefield, concentrate their forces. Henry's decision to engage wasn't stupid. It was calculated sacrifice. He traded his life, his army, his legacy for 3 days of delay. In the brutal calculus of 1241, it may have been the right choice. The longer-term historical trajectory is dizzying to contemplate. The Mongol withdrawal in 1242 left Eastern Europe devastated but independent. Had they remained, had they consolidated, the entire cultural development of the continent shifts. No Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, no Prussian militarism, no Habsburg Empire in its historical form. Western Europe, France, England, the Italian states, would have developed in the shadow of a Mongol-controlled East. The Renaissance might have occurred earlier, fueled by direct access to Asian knowledge through Mongol trade routes. Or it might never have happened at all, strangled by perpetual war. We can trace other threads. The Black Death, which reached Europe via Mongol trade routes in 1347, might have arrived sooner and more devastatingly if Mongol control had been permanent. The Ottoman Empire's rise in Anatolia was enabled partly by Mongol conquest fragmenting the region. Remove that factor, and the next 3 centuries look radically different. Every alternative timeline branches from this one mud-soaked field in Silesia, from the decision of one Polish duke to charge into impossible odds. Strip away the mythology and the nationalist narratives, and you're left with an uncomfortable truth. Liegnitz demonstrates that courage is not enough. This is not a comfortable lesson. We want to believe that bravery matters, that determination can overcome material disadvantage, that the righteous can triumph through sheer force of will. Liegnitz says otherwise. It says that tactics matter more than valor, that preparation trumps improvisation, that a coordinated mediocre army will destroy an uncoordinated excellent one. The 70 knights, whether literal number or symbolic representation, rode into battle knowing they would die. They charged anyway, not because they were stupid, but because in their worldview, some things were worth dying for: honor, duty, the protection of their people, the chance that their sacrifice might buy time for others. This kind of choice echoes through history. Thermopylae, the Alamo, Rorke's Drift, desperate stands where small forces bought time with blood. We remember these battles not because they were victories, but because they reveal something essential about human nature, our willingness to stand against a void even when standing is futile. But Liegnitz also whispers a darker lesson, that this kind of courage can be exploited. The Mongols understood European knightly culture better than the knights understood themselves. They knew that if you insulted a knight's honor, he would charge. If you threatened his lands, he would engage. If you gave him the choice between prudent retreat and glorious death, he would choose death every time. The Mongols turned European virtue into European weakness. They weaponized courage against those who possessed it. This is why Liegnitz remains relevant 8 centuries later. We still face this tension between the values we claim to fight for and the pragmatic requirements of victory, between doing what feels right and doing what works, between the heroic ideal and the brutal reality. Duke Henry had the choice every leader eventually faces. Act according to your principles knowing you'll lose, or abandon your principles for a chance at victory. He chose his principles. He charged, and he died. Was he right? History doesn't answer that question. It only records the consequences. Today, if you visit Liegnitz in southwestern Poland, you'll find a small monument on the Wallstatt Plain. It's understated, a stone marker, some weathered text, flowers occasionally left by those who remember. The field itself is farmland now. Wheat grows where men died. The earth has long since absorbed the blood. But on April 9th each year, a small ceremony occurs. Polish historians, military veterans, descendants of those who fought gather to honor the 70 knights. They read the names of the identified dead. They lay wreaths. They remember that sometimes courage means choosing to lose. The lesson of Liegnitz is not that bravery is meaningless. It's that bravery divorced from tactical reality becomes a beautiful way to die. Henry and his knights bought Europe time not through their courage, but through their willingness to trade that courage for strategic necessity. They understood they were currency, and they spent themselves deliberately. The Mongols never returned to Poland. The invasion of 1241 remained their high water mark. Whether that was because of Ogedi's death or because battles like Liegnitz convinced them that European conquest would be too costly, or because of factors we'll never know, history leaves that question open. What remains is a story. 70 against 10,000. Steel against speed. Medieval certainty against nomadic fluidity. And a smoke-choked plain where 2 military doctrines collided and only one walked away. Duke Henry's head was never recovered. His body rests in Wrocław Cathedral. But his decision to charge into certain death rather than let evil pass unopposed echoes through 8 centuries. Sometimes we celebrate victories. Sometimes we remember defeats. At Liegnitz, we remember both. The Mongol tactical masterpiece and European willingness to face annihilation rather than surrender without a fight. Both deserve remembering. Both teach us something about the nature of war, the price of freedom, and the terrible choices that define civilization's turning points. The wheat grows high now. The ravens have long since left. But the lesson remains written in blood and bone beneath Polish soil. Courage alone is never enough. But without it, nothing else matters. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal realities of medieval warfare, please help us win our own battle against the algorithm by hitting that like button and subscribing. It really does make a difference. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you were Duke Henry, knowing the odds, would you have charged or waited for reinforcements? Would you trade certain death for a chance to delay evil? I read every comment. Thanks for watching, and check out the video on your screen now to see how another impossible stand changed the course of history. Until next time, keep questioning the official story.